come here, you dead-wetted varmint.
Oh, says let that there pig be. You deep for something.
Hush up and get out of my way. I intend to catch that critter. Sweet!
If you don't leave it alone, I'll get the pappy.
Sweet! Here! That's it. Now look what you done. You tripped me up.
And I done it a purpose, too. That's my pig.
It ain't. It's mine. I seen it was.
Why, that critter's got Taylor writ all over his face.
Taylor? You some kin old Jed Taylor?
I'm his dadder. And maybe you heard, when a Taylor gets riled...
It ain't no worse than a hickok. And I'm a hickok.
You? A hickok? Them's fighting words.
Huh?
Wars we're shooting on. Get off of this land. We ain't had words with hickoks for nigh on to 50 yards. Get with the hickocks. We don't talk. We shoot.
From what we've just heard, it would seem that a leaning toward the gentle art of feuding still runs in some families. However, I don't expect that we'll be devoting any more time to feuds on this excursion in science, even though we will be discussing the matter of inheritance. For Emerson Markham obtained our source material from Dr. Jack Shultz of the Lankenau Hospital Research Institute at Philadelphia, and Dr. Shultz's field is genetics. Without further delay, then, let's ask Emerson Markham to tell us Dr. Shultz's ideas on the subject, how much do we inherit? Ladies and gentlemen, our science reporter.
Thank you, Bob Stone, and how do you do, everyone? In some of the old legends you'll remember, the baby prince was abandoned at birth, brought up by the shepherds in the mountains, only to return at maturity with all of his kingly qualities radiant. The royal blood was manifest, no matter how plebeian the upbringing. But in other legends, it is the foundling in the bulrushes who makes use of his kingly upbringing to become a leader of people.
Pardon the incredulity, Emerson, but are legends science?
Well, yes, they have a definite bearing in this case, Bob. You see, what we have in these folk tales is the recognition of the complexities of growth. The mature individual is the product of the capacities with which he was initially endowed and of the opportunities for their realization provided by the environment in which he developed.
Bringing up the old matter of inheritance versus environment?
Yes, and it is difficult indeed to separate the relative parts played by these two groups of factors in the individual character in man. Yet the control of man's fate ultimately will rest upon understanding just what, when, and how specific traits are irrevocably determined in individual development.
That's no mean problem either.
That's right. We can't easily tell just by looking whether a particular trait is due to a difference between the environments of the individuals or to a difference in their inborn traits. Suppose that a baby is born blind due to a cataract in the lens of the eye. We inquire as to its ancestry. In some cases, it is found that there is a history of cataract in the family. But in others, it will turn out that no relatives of the child show any such defect. The child's mother had a mild case of German measles during her pregnancy. She suffered only slightly, but the developing embryo was irrevocably damaged by the disease. The end result is hard to distinguish from a real hereditary difference.
And how far have the geneticists gone toward the solution of such problems, Emerson?
The science of genetics is only about 50 years old, a very young science as they go. But Dr. Shultz says that they know enough now to have an idea of what a hereditary difference is due to. It is a difference in the development of an organism caused by a change in the number or kind of chemical units in the tiny cells of which it is made.
Aren't those called genes, Emerson?
Yes, Bob, they are. And the basis of our information on these units, the genes, comes from the differences in the development of individuals in which special genes are changed. In some organisms, certain small flies, Indian corn, a variety of mold, enough has been worked out to give us a pretty clear idea of just how the individual genes are arranged, to make maps of the bodies in the cell, the chromosomes in which they are carried.
But genes are pretty small things to work with and come up with answers like that.
In addition, they know that there is a fairly intimate association between the genes and the chemical substances known as the nucleoproteins. Now, actually, these substances may in fact be the genes, or at least be their most significant parts, according to Dr. Shultz.
How do they decide that?
Well, the essential fact of heredity is the production of like by like. And it seems now that wherever this capacity for producing more of its own kind is found, whether in viruses or in other organisms, nucleoproteins are in the limelight. Thus, the gene seems, Dr. Shultz said, to be a specific kind of chemical substances, probably a nucleoprotein, which has the property of controlling the manufacture in the organism of specific other substances, enzymes, which enter into still other reactions that finally are evident in the completed organism.
Intricate, to say the least.
Yes, it is. And it is the fact that so many reactions are involved in the determination of each special character that makes it difficult to tell by looking at a person whether the difference is due to a gene change or not. For any environmental upset has the possibility of destroying an essential link in the chain of reactions that leads to successful development. Either a hereditary difference or a disease of the embryo can give us a blind baby. Now, all of these reactions are, so far as is known, physiochemical, which means that we must consider them as due to substances of special kinds reacting with each other.
Does what we eat have anything to do with it?
Some of these substances are supplied by nutrition. Others are present as the forerunners of more highly specialized substances, and present in a very much smaller amount. Faulty nutrition may deprive a special reaction of one of its component substances, and in a different category, infection by some other organism, the virus of German measles in our example, may rob the developing organism of materials which are diverted to the parasite's use. But the net result might be almost the same as if the gene which started the whole process had been lost in the first place. The reaction so important to development could not proceed to completion, and because of that, the mature individual would be different from his fellow man.
How about differences in size or build, Emerson? How can they be explained genetically?
Well, consider what the size of an animal is dependent upon, how large the bones are, how much fat accumulates, a host of delicately balanced interrelations, you see. Now, many of these are controlled by hormones. In the case of vertebrates, the pituitary gland is prominent. Suppose that one had an individual without a certain part of the pituitary gland. Such operations can be performed, and the individuals are dwarfed. But a strain of mice is known which is dwarfed because the cells of the pituitary gland which secrete the needed hormone are never found. Moreover, the dwarf mouse, given pituitary hormone at the proper age, can grow up to be quite normal in size. If we supply the lack, we can provide the condition for normal development in the abnormal type. And all this is due to a change in one gene.
But growth depends on more than this pituitary hormone, doesn't it?
Oh, indeed it does. The control of size difference by the pituitary hormone is only one of the many ways in which it can be affected, Bob. And for each of these ways, genetic differences are conceivable. Differences affecting ease of nutrition, which covers a multitude of possibilities, such as the amount of vitamins a given individual needs, and so on. What we come to finally is the realization that in an organism like man, where genetic differences between individuals are maximal, much study is needed before the roles of heredity and environment are evident.
And that, I take it, is what geneticists are aiming at.
Yes. The confusion when we try to trace pedigrees of feeble-mindedness or genius or resistance or predisposition to diseases like cancer is only too obvious. No glib assurance is possible here. Dr. Shultz and his co-workers believe that we must have a detailed human genetics before we can make definite statements about hereditary traits. He said this isn't too optimistic a hope either, since, fortunately, the techniques, both in the analysis of the pedigrees of hereditary differences and in the direct study of the chromosomes of man, are continually being improved. Dr. Shultz said that, on examination, the question, how much do we inherit, becomes changed into, what do we inherit? And the answer is, the conditions of development. The genes which come from our fathers and mothers determine part of the conditions of our development. The hazards of nutrition and infection, most of the remainder.
I've been wondering, where does the idea of eugenics fit into this particular picture, Emerson?
Well, there was a time when eugenic programs for man were set up on premises that were relatively naive, according to Dr. Shultz, when they were not malicious, that is. Characteristics were irrevocably hereditary, and the belief was that selection against them by sterilization of the unfit would accomplish immediate benefits. In certain cases, he says, this is perhaps still true, but soberer calculations indicate that the benefits were easy to overrate. The goal now is evidently a more positive, a more constructive one. Knowing that we inherit the conditions of development, our task, both as scientist and citizen, must be to understand them sufficiently well to make the best use of the genes we start with. Dr. Shultz believes this a dangerous gift, for it means that we must still decide what is best. It is only too often that one man's dream is another's nightmare.
Thank you, Emerson. And ladies and gentlemen, probably many of you would like to have a paper which covers this story we've just brought you. Dr. Shultz has prepared a paper for us which contains the facts we've just discussed and others we didn't have time to go into. To get your copy, all you have to do is address your requests to Excursions in Science, in care of the station to which you are now listening, asking for scientific paper number 214, entitled, How Much Do We Inherit? That's How Much Do We Inherit? Scientific paper number 214. We'll see that one is put in the mail for you free of charge. And now, once again, we've come to that portion of our program wherein you listeners have a chance of determining our subjects for discussion, namely the question and answer period. The questions which you're about to hear, ladies and gentlemen, have been sent in by people like ourselves, laymen with an active scientific curiosity. The answers reflect the best obtainable information since they are based on facts provided by staff members of the General Electric Research Laboratory or of other equally reliable institutions. Well, Emerson, let's get down to business with this communication from a lady who asks, has any scientific theory been evolved on what force causes capillary action?
Well, to actually explain what is meant by capillary action would no doubt require several hours or perhaps even the writing of a book.
Which, of course, we don't have time to do. Couldn't you tell us briefly?
Well, I'll try. It so happens that when a tube with a fine opening in it is immersed in water, the liquid may rise in the tube in apparent defiance of gravity. The smaller the bore of the tube, the higher the rise of the liquid.
How fine would that be?
If a liquid wets the walls of a tube, the force of adhesion between the liquid and the glass must be greater than the cohesion between the liquid molecules. Then, the liquid molecules crawl rapidly up the sides of the tube, and the liquid column rises too in order to keep the liquid surface small. Now, the exposed surface is curved downward and would be smaller if it were flat across the tube. Well, the rise continues until the upward pull of the surface, trying to contract, just balances the downward pull of the liquid column beneath it. Incidentally, where tiny crevices and passageways are present in porous materials, capillary action explains the many common processes of wetting and the rise of liquids.
As for instance, where?
Well, there's the rise of oil in lamp wicks, for example. And then there's the absorption of ink by blotting paper and the rise of moisture in dry soil. And finally, there's the effective drying action of towels.
Now, this next gentleman really poses a problem. He plans to build a sundial, and he'd like to know at what angle from the vertical he should set the vane. And, in addition, he asks how to set it correctly for north and south, whether by compass or by the North Star.
The angle depends upon the latitude of the particular place in which the sundial is to be placed, Bob. To set it correctly, it should be pointed to the true north. The sundial disc must be level. The disc must be turned in such a way that the triangular piece lies in the north and south planes.
Well, how would he accomplish that?
The level disc should be turned until the shadow indicates the correct sun time or shadow time at the moment when the adjustment is made. Then, if the disc is fastened in place, the sundial will indicate true sun time throughout the year. It's important to allow for the equation of time, that is, the difference between sun time and clock time. This varies at different times of the year in degrees only occasionally.
Well, here's one from a young lady who asks, how are whales different from other fish?
Well, whales aren't like fish at all. The whale is a mammal of the higher series. Whales are similar to the mammals which live on land. They are warm-blooded and they breathe air by lungs instead of gills. As they breathe only air, they must regularly seek the surface of the water. They have no scales on the skin like the fish and have a skeleton, brain, heart, and blood vessels of the same type as land mammals, and even have hands of the five-finger type.
Well, some five-fingered hands will be closing around our throats if we don't leave when our time is up. So I'll hastily say, thank you, Emerson Markham, and goodbye, everyone, until our next Excursion in Science.